All right. So that's recording. Anyway, hi Sam, how are you?
Good, how are you, Yoni?
Great. So we're going to talk about your class from last, was it Wednesday or Thursday? Wednesday, January 8th. It was a 10th grade, class, J block, one of the 70-minute blocks. You guys it was a prep class for a big project the kids are going to begin working on. So why don't we just start with what the class was about, what the goals of the class were, and then we'll dive into our work.
Sure. So the project that students are working on is working in partner small groups. They're going to be creating a virtual museum of propaganda pieces from the Cultural Revolution. So the overall question is, during the Cultural Revolution, how did the Chinese government use propaganda to influence young people? Everything they're choosing is directed at the youth. So the goal for today was to, first of all, understand what propaganda is. So there was a definition and an exercise for that. And then we were going to look at breaking them up into groups. They then looked at some background information about some of the different campaigns that were launched during this event. And the goal for that was to have them understand not just the broad, the big picture of the Cultural Revolution, so what is the story of this event, but also what were some of the techniques for propaganda that were used during this period.
During each of the individual eras.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it was the Cultural Revolution was divided. Nobody said we're going to begin chapter 1 now, and
right.
But from a historical perspective, it seems to have been divided into several eras.
Yeah.
Am I understanding that correctly? And
correct.
And one of the ways that you could distinguish between one era and another era is by analyzing the propaganda used over time, and you can see distinctions between, 1966 to 68, 68 to 70, 70 to 72. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's it, pretty much.
Okay, and so part of the goal of the class was the students would understand, this is just me trying to recollect from based on what I observed, was that we'll start with a big look at what propaganda is generally, looking at a World War I image, the famous Uncle Sam pointing, I want you for the army. Once they understand what propaganda is generally, we're going to zero in on propaganda used during the Cultural Revolution, and to start thinking about that, I'm going to overview the Cultural Revolution in 3 chapters.
That's it. Yep.
Okay.
So for each of those 3 chapters, they were given, the materials were on OneNote, so they had a slide with a few basic points about, here's when this campaign started, here's the objectives, and here's some of the outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, there was a single propaganda poster from each one. So one thing I've been working on is trying to have an overall, a flexible overall question that gets around the worksheety, bing, 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 bing kind of thing.
Right.
So formulating an overall question that will have them thinking about those different components in order to answer it, ideally. So the one I was experimenting with this was basically to what extent did the propaganda techniques change to match to what extent did the changing propaganda techniques reflect the changing objectives of these campaigns as they went forward?
To what extent did the changing,
Did techniques change to match the objectives?
Yeah. Yeah, so to what extent did the propaganda techniques change to match the objectives of that particular era? Is that?
That's it?
Yeah. And that was the big thought question. So just to remember what you had them do, and then we're gonna home in on the specific area of practice, pacing. So you had posted on their OneNote page an overview of the 3 eras, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
Each overview was about a couple sentences.
So it's 3 bullet points, so 5 sentences.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And then under the bullet points, each of those 3 to 5 bullet points was a image of the propaganda with
Yeah.
translation, captions, etc. And so you gave that to them. You open up to your class OneNote page, and now go answer this question together in Chavruta. Is that how? That's my memory.
Yeah, so I didn't name Haruta as the style, but that was, pretty much what they were doing. So they had a thought partner for this.
Yeah.
And, work through these, so I gave them a graphic organizer as well. So for each one, it's like, what are the objectives, what are the outcomes, and then list a few techniques that you see in the poster.
Mm-hmm.
And then using that ammunition, they had to develop a claim for the overall question.
Right. So there's one more sort of goals kind of question, and then we'll look at pacing. So what would a good answer from the kids have looked like answering that question?
Sure. So it's a continuity or change thing. So a good answer could be, for example, although the goals change, like an although or while statement, right? So while the objectives of the Cultural Revolution campaigns changed quite a bit, right? They could identify in what ways.
Mm-hmm.
The propaganda techniques were actually essentially the same. So they had a body of techniques that were being deployed across these 3 campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
Really, there was very little change
Mm-hmm.
in the techniques.
Yeah. And so would you expect in that answer, if they said, although the objectives of the eras changed, would you then expect it to say comma, for example, or parentheses, whatever, for example, it shifted from here to here? Or would you...
So just based on where, like for 10th graders, where they're at in this time of the year, and with this section in particular, I would be happy if they had an answer that didn't necessarily name specifics.
Mm-hmm.
But when they presented that overall answer, they should be ready for a follow-up, like, okay, so how did the objectives change? Right?
Right.
Where are we at the start versus
Right.
where are we at the end?
Right.
So if they're able to then follow that up and say, well, at the start they're inciting the youth, they're having them attack all of Mao's enemies, or they're having them tear down these cultural sites. And at the end they're just trying to get rid of him, ship them off to the countryside.
Right.
Okay, if they get that, great.
Yeah.
So that's big picture kind of stuff.
Right.
And actually, I would anticipate a level of vagueness in the answers initially in that discussion. And then my goal would be to use the conversation with follow-up questions
Right.
to arrive at an understanding of,
Right.
well, what really is changing?
Right.
And
So
then-
ultimately, what
yeah.
just to name what we're talking about here, and I'm going to pull out of it in a second, but I think it's certainly worth putting a pin in and coming back to,
Mhm.
is how do we teach the kids to write quality thesis statements? Because ultimately, right. So sentence 1, which is although although the objectives of the Cultural Revolution stayed the same, the propaganda changed over time,
Yeah.
for example. That would be great as a sentence 1, but then sentence 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 would have to have, from 66 to 72, the objectives were roughly similar because blah blah blah, and then sentence 3 and 4 which is I think what you're getting at,
Yeah.
would explain how, would give specific, changes in it. So how do we teach the kids to do that? I think is sort of what we're dancing around here, and that's a really interesting question that I would love to start thinking about now.
Yeah. For the project as well, they have to write a thesis. So
Yeah.
there's continuity there in terms of skills, and I think
Right.
I could totally have been more explicit
Yeah,
with that.
interesting. Okay,
Yeah,
so that's
like in terms of like, hey, look, here's what we're actually practicing
yeah,
today.
yeah,
This is not just like an intellectual exercise, you're actually refining a really important skill for the project. And then there could be a follow-up to that, right? Where
So-
it's like, okay, so here's like
Yeah.
a little mini rubric, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
take a look at the thing that you just wrote, or switch it with another group, and grade each other's, right? How'd you do with this thesis? And there's criteria, like even from 9th grade, we introduce it in the first unit, like what does a good thesis look like? I
Yeah.
think that criteria is pretty darn good.
yeah, yeah.
And it can totally be brought back for this. So, yeah.
So I'm
That's one big difference.
I'm wondering about this.
Yeah.
That's one big difference. What?
So as a repeat, right? If I was going to do this
Do it
again,
again, that would be different.
being much more specific and articulate about
Yeah.
what's being practiced, and then knowing that we're going to leverage it into like, this is a practice thing,
Yeah.
like where we're not just understanding the story, but we're also practicing one key skill.
Right.
So you have the opportunity to use this as
So let me ask you a question, right? So because and it may actually we may not pull out of this. Heidi, we'll just hear your thoughts on this.
yeah.
So the question that that we left class, we spent a few minutes after class chatting about what when we have our conversation and what we want to be thinking about. So the question that I posed